Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cult Conversations, the Influence Continuum with Dr. Steve Hassan. And I have a colleague and old friend with me from the UK, a social psychologist, Alexandra Stein, who we go back a long time.
We do.
And we're going to have a fascinating time talking about your life journey, but your book about brainwashing, which I will announce the title in a second, and then we'll get into current political topics like the cult of Trump. Let me just say you're a writer, an educator. You specialize in the social psychology of ideological extremism and other dangerous social relationships. You've held academic posts at the University of Birkbeck, London, the University of Westminster, the University of Minnesota, and until recently an honorary research fellow at the University of Sussex. You do programs and create materials to help people understand how to identify and protect themselves and others from recruitment to cultic and extremist groups. You also study positive social relationships, things like small democracy, inclusivity, healthy social and personal networks. And let me say, like me, you got interested in this topic from a personal experience that altered the trajectory of your life work. Your first book, I will just read, is Inside Out. You want to hold it up. A memoir of entering and breaking out of a Minneapolis political cult. And you exited yourself. My recollection is you read Combating Cult Mind Control, and that's where we connected. But most importantly, I want to talk about a more recent book, which I understand has a second edition called Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, Attachment in Cults and Totalitarian Systems. This is Routledge Press, so this is an academic book. And with that, I want to say thank you for speaking out as a survivor and as an academic scholar. Welcome to the Influence Continuum.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. It has been a while since we talked, and we did meet in, well, it was 1991
Wow.
when, yeah, when I asked you for help to help my, I'd gotten out of the cult and late found your book. It was pretty much one of the first things I found, along
Hmm.
with Lifton's 8 criteria,
Right.
and a support group in Minneapolis called Free Minds that I'm
Yep.
forever indebted to. And then you worked with the family, myself and the family of my then husband, to help him get out. And
I hope it's okay for you to say that, but nobody knows their name, although they
nobody
may.
knows their name,
Right.
but it's my life history as well. So
Yeah, no, it's very common when
yeah,
somebody leaves, they want to help their friends and
yeah.
loved ones, and
And
it's
he did get out. So
yeah,
with that help,
and I
and
believe
thank
he's doing
goodness.
quite well
Yeah.
from what I hear.
And my children are doing well. They
Great.
were small at the time. Anyway, so that was very helpful. And just one little tiny note. The reason uh, it was very important to me, your book, both in understanding cults in general, along with the other literature I found, but
Mm.
also you had a tiny little footnote in there that referred to political cults, which nobody really talked about at that time. And that footnote pointed me to Janja Lalich and to her work. And we also became colleagues because I managed to find her phone number in the old-fashioned yellow pages, or white pages as they were,
Right.
as used to exist. Um, so it was a really important thing for me.
Yeah, and Yanya
Yeah,
was in a political cult.
she
Was it the
was.
same one?
No,
No,
totally different.
just a
Totally different.
different one,
Yeah,
left wing
yeah.
political cult, we can
Or
say.
left wing, as I like
Right.
to say.
as opposed to right wing.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're both against authoritarianism on the left
exactly,
or the right, or
exactly,
any way around. It's just about abusing human rights and
exactly.
enslaving the mind and body of folks. So, Alexandra, let's start, if you don't mind, wherever you want to start for my audience, because aside from I told you before we hit the record button that part of my agenda is to feature survivors of cults who've gone on to become, scholars, very successful. I want to do a general message. There's life after cult, even if it doesn't feel like that initially. And I want to open up the gates for people to be able to leave and get past the phobia and all the indoctrination. So
Yeah. And one thing in my story that I like to tell
please.
is that, I got out when I was 36 years old after being in for 10 years, 10
Uh-huh.
long and boring years.
Mm.
Um, and I did not go to university. Well, I had left school very young, just in my own history before the cult. And I
Right.
didn't have any, I didn't really have a high school a diploma or anything. Um, But I was able, through various means, including Yanni Lalich actually giving me the opportunity to write a paper after I got out, and had recovered somewhat,
Mm-hmm.
where she invited me to write a paper for a women's issue of the International Occultic Studies Journal, and
Uh-huh.
I did my first publication ever, which was a kind of teaching myself along the way how to do it, bit of research about mothers and cults. And because I had that paper, I was able to kind of finagle my way into university without having the appropriate qualifications, I should add. But the point is that I really want to make is I was 45 when I started going to university.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when I do work with people coming out of cults and they have such grief about the lost years and the lost opportunities. And I like to tell that story to people to say, well, yes, all of that is true, but your life isn't over yet. And there's plenty of things that can come your way. But you do have to, not everyone has resources, and I had some resources of various kinds and some support. So I don't want to say everyone can do what I did, but everyone can do something.
Yeah, and you
And
can follow
yeah,
your passion.
yeah,
And 45, a lot of my clients are like, I'm 33, it's too late
mm,
to go back to college. And I'm saying the same message. Of
yeah.
course it isn't. You have your whole life ahead of you. I
And you
did
have
my doctorate in my 60s.
exactly, and you have some advantages as what in England we call a mature student.
Yes,
You're actually much smarter than those 18-year-olds who don't know what they're doing and what or why.
right,
And, you've got passion, you've got drive, you've got, a lot of lived experience.
right.
So I really do encourage people to carry on with their education in some way if they can manage it. And if
Great,
and if that's their interest, some people may want to go carve wooden spoons in the countryside,
right,
and that's okay too.
right. So let's move into terror, love, and brainwashing, and feel free to talk about the cult of Trump or what's happening in England or world events.
Well, that's a big opening
Well, I'm
statement, but
pitching you
I
a
can.
softball.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can go there. I just turned 70 last year, and I would like to put my feet up and spend more time with my grandchildren and, lie in the sun and so forth. But it's very hard to do that right now when I feel, and I think people in our field feel, that what we're witnessing requires our knowledge and expertise. And
Exactly.
I don't mean to sound arrogant, I really don't. Um, but we are seeing a totalitarian system writ large in the US and other countries. And,
Yep.
I do feel we have an obligation to speak up.
Right.
And it's very hard for people to resist these systems when there is a total silence. And
Yes.
that's what these systems kind of rely on, is silence. So those of us who are in a position to speak up, I think, well, that's what I want to try and do as much as possible, while
Yeah, me
still
too.
seeing my grandchildren and
Yeah.
lying in the sun. It's not an either or.
And as a social psychologist, you have a particular angle on psychology. I have the clinical background. I've studied social psychology, but this is your expertise, so you can explain how people can be influenced ethically and unethically.
Well, I can try, though sometimes I have to say that current events defeat me sometimes.
Mm,
But I think, what we're certainly seeing is the power of propaganda when people are isolated, and when they're
mm,
isolated from narratives that reflect reality, what we might call the truth or factual narratives. And we've lost that. I just read Tim Snyder's book on freedom,
mm.
which is a little abstract and not that easy to grasp, but it has a lot of value to it. His other book on tyranny is great, and everyone should read it right now.
Yeah, I read it. Hmm.
But on freedom, he talks about various elements that we need to function in more or less democratic societies. And one of them is factuality. It's like that we can observe our environment and reflect it more or less accurately.
Yep.
And that has just gone. It's
Well, it's not gone, but
yeah,
the information manipulation and control by the authoritarians, they want to confuse people, and they want to say that you create your own reality, and if you believe it and repeat it over and over again, then the brain will accept it as a fact when it's not. And categorically, there's no such thing as alternative facts. It's called lies.
and then you get these absurd kinds of things, as I read in the paper today, with these poor people with their kids going to hospital because of vitamin A overdoses, because that's supposedly going to protect them from measles, when we have excellent vaccinations
Right.
that have been protecting people for decades.
Yes.
And so people, and the worst thing about this lack of factuality in the media and the propaganda that is around people is that as I think you just said, it confuses people. And
Right.
once you have a confused population, confusion isn't a comfortable feeling.
Nope.
It's uncertainty is different. Uncertainty, you can go, yeah, I don't really know the answer, but you know that you don't know the answer. So in
Right.
that sense, you're not confused.
Right.
But when you're confused, as when you're in a cult, you're just like, cannot compute.
Yeah, you
You
don't have
literally,
the critical thinking,
yeah, and you
and
don't,
you're sleep deprived often, and you have phobias that have been installed that you're not aware of that intrude as well.
have what we can call metacognition, which is the
Right.
ability to think about how you're thinking
Right.
and to think about how other people are thinking and feeling. So you just are this kind of, and so when someone gives you a nice, clear answer, there's a feeling of relief.
Mm.
Oh, that's what's going on. Everyone outside the cult is evil, or whatever the narrative
All
is.
the media is fake, except
Yeah.
for the stuff that confirms that we're great.
And Donald Trump knows all the answers, and he's going to lead us to safety and prosperity.
Yeah.
And flying in the face of all the evidence that we have about that. But once you're isolated and confused, it's just a human thing to want to find a place where you feel more comfortable and less afraid.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. And if I may, I'll just say, as a mental health professional, the framing that makes the most sense to me as an ex-member is it's a dissociative disorder where you have a pseudo identity that's a cult identity and your real identity is still there, but largely you're operating out of the pseudo identity that's disconnected from your body. So you're not feeling your intuitions, you're not connected to your conscience and your critical faculties. And that's why I tell people, take a break, like turn off your phone, go into nature, remember who you were before you ever heard of the group. Remember what your values are and important people in your life, and learn about the bite model of authoritarian control and Lifton's 8 criteria, etc., and seek out critics and former members and listen for yourself if what they're saying makes sense to your own experience.
And of course, some of that, as I'm sure you also know, is more difficult for people who are born in a cult.
Yes,
or
of
raised since
course.
small, because they can't refer back to who they
Right.
were. But they can still refer to their physical direct experience.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
so let me just, if you don't mind, so from me, many people have left authoritarian cults, including the Mormons and the JWs, but haven't done their homework like you did and I did to understand what are the mechanisms that hacked our minds, and so they became more vulnerable in many cases to going into the cult of Trump or some other group, and we refer to that as cult hopping, but it's because it's familiar. The structures, the simplistic all or nothing, good versus evil, us versus them, and the certainty that the leader says, we know the truth, we're going to fix everything.
I mean, going back to what you were saying about the cult identity, the pseudo identity, I don't quite use the same terminology, but I know we're talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I look at it, and this goes to the attachment theory
Yep,
lens
please.
that I use,
Yep.
that when people are isolated within a frightening relationship, which is what cults are, but the frightening entity or person is portraying themselves as the good person.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this dynamic of the follower, shall we say,
Yep.
trying to relieve the frightening stimulus that they're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And the only place they have to go to get comfort is that frightening figure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very destabilizing kind of psychological dynamic. And that causes a couple things. It causes people to keep trying and trying to get comfort from the wrong place,
Right.
but they've been isolated, so that's the only place there is to go. And
Mm-hmm.
that failed attempt to get comfort and going towards that frightening figure causes dissociation, which you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And dissociation, the way I talk about that, is that and we kind of know this, although we need a lot more neuroscience studies on this,
Mm-hmm.
is this little piece in the brain that connects in a way, this is how I conceptualize it, one's feelings, the sensory feelings that we get from our environment and which come in, through our kind of through our brainstem, and then
Mm-hmm.
go up to our feeling area of our brain, the limbic system.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little piece that connects that to our frontal cortex, which is the bit I'm using to talk to you now,
Yes.
and the bit that we need to read all those books on your bookshelves. It's very language based. It's, higher order thinking.
Right.
That little bit that connects the feeling to the higher order thinking bit, when you're in trauma or this chronic fear that we see in cults and in totalitarian systems, that is not activating.
Mm-hmm.
So not in a normal situation, that would activate and it would say, this feeling that I'm having, do I need to think further about it? And then you might go, oh yeah, I'm in a dangerous situation. Let me find a way out. But if it's not activated, you're frozen, you're paralyzed.
Yep.
And then, so it's kind of like just this slice through your brain in a way where, as you were saying, the feeling bit and the thinking bit are disconnected.
Yep.
Now, in that gap that's created, the
Mm-hmm.
totalitarian or cultic leader can tell you what you're feeling. And that's the cult narrative, or the totalitarian narrative, or the fascist narrative,
Mm-hmm.
whatever you want to call it.
We have different models a little bit, but it's more overlapping and connected than we disagree with each other. I've been studying neuroscience as well, and there's so much more that we're uncovering about mirror neurons and entrainment that happens person to person, that groups also rely on in terms of the indoctrination process. But let's talk some more. So I have a few questions that I jotted down. So your fundamental attachment theory is that when people get recruited deceptively into a cult, their attachment is made disorganized regardless of whether they were securely attached as an infant for the first few years, because that's normally how clinicians are trained to think about attachment theory.
Exactly. And, people who don't understand cults always pretty much always make these assumptions like this person was needy or stupid or weak or needed to belong.
Right.
Which always makes me laugh, the last one, because as human beings, we all need to belong. It's a fundamental human need.
Right.
We wouldn't survive long if we didn't. But yeah, my view is that regardless of whether one was brought up in a safe environment or not, or whatever, the whole mechanism of a cult is to destabilize and what in attachment theory is called create disorganized attachment. And that being when you're in a situation that's created in people when they're in a situation where the supposed caregiver is frightening. And as I've just mentioned, that's very destabilizing. It's not if you're not isolated. So this is why I always say my number one warning to people is don't get into any kind of group or relationship that's isolating you. Because if you're not isolated, if your mother or group cult leader so-and-so is frightening, but you've got a lot of other relationships outside of that, you can just leave and say, oh, that person's scary. But
yeah, you can leave, but people are, sorry for interrupting. It's just, the cell phone is omnipresent, and I'm seeing a real shift in the way cults are operating by recruiting online and keeping people so mesmerized and dopamine addicted to their cell phones. They don't need to be a physical isolation. They can be psychologically isolated and programmed, so that the point they may try to be overzealous and they alienate their family and friends, and then the family and friends cut them off because they're so obnoxious.
I totally agree, Steve. And actually, what I really mean to say is they are socially and psychologically isolated. You're absolutely right. They do not need to be physically isolated, though that does help, especially if you're going to go into the real extreme stuff.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's social and psychological isolation.
Yep. So we were discussing about how on cell phones people are being influenced, in many cases unduly influenced, to be believing crazy conspiracy theories and extremist groups and such. Many people were tricked into voting for Brexit. Many people were tricked to voting for Trump. And because you are in a political cult, I'm curious if you have particular thoughts that the differences between religious cults and political cults, perhaps.
Maybe I'll first talk about my own experience and then try to zoom out a bit.
Okay.
My understanding is that religious cults, you often have more of the kind of, shall we say, hypnotic elements, I think. The
Mm-hmm.
praying and chanting and that kind of thing. In political cults, at least the one I was in, you just have hard work.
Mm.
Um, you we did none of that kind of hypnotic stuff, but we were
Interesting.
very, very tired.
Mm-hmm.
And we were very, well, we didn't even, I mean, the studying part came at the beginning, but then
Mm-hmm.
once you were in, we didn't study anything. We just worked. Um,
But you had group processes, if I remember.
we
No?
didn't really get together in groups. No,
I see.
we did not. We lived in
Mm-hmm.
very small houses. Like I lived with two other people. Then I would
Mm-hmm.
work. You worked on programs, so I worked in the bakery, but you didn't have. You would connect with people in usually one or two or three people at most. It was very
Uh-huh.
highly secure. It's
Mm.
kind of cell structure, but you had no time for anything else. You
Mm-hmm.
lived in fear of being criticized. We'd get a lot of things through memos, kind of hand delivered, typed up memos, telling us
Mm.
what we had done wrong or telling us what the next thing that we had to do was. We had to criticize each other. We had all these crazy forms. They were a little bit hypnotic, or they were dissociating.
Yeah.
So we'd get these forms we had to fill out. They were completely nutty. When I teach, I like to show people these forms because you look at them and you go, what does any of this mean? And
Right.
and I tell people, well, even when I was in the cult, I didn't know what any of it meant.
Right.
But you would try to make sense of nonsense,
Right.
and that is dissociating. If you really believe that it's actually saying something sensible, but you're just too stupid to understand,
Right.
which is kind of universal in cult discourse, isn't it?
It is
Yeah.
indeed.
But we did it by these forms.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
But Milton Erickson, the psychiatrist, who, by the way, the CIA consulted with for MK Ultra, and whose work was ultimately uh, studied, copied by NLP and neurolinguistic programming. Erickson just said the key to the mind was if you wanted to change beliefs. And of course, he was a mental health professional, so he was focused on helping people to be functional. But what he was saying is that you create confusion by speaking things that don't make sense. So the person goes inside to say, what is he saying? He sounds like it should mean something. I don't understand. Maybe I'm stupid. Maybe I'm not enlightened enough. But as you're doing that internal, self-criticism or analysis, you are entering a state of trance, an altered state where you're more suggestible to indoctrination.
Yeah, I think that, and you see that in the way Trump speaks. I mean, it's interesting that in one of the chapters in Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, I try to get at some of this, though that could be a whole book of its own, is the kind of analyzing the discourse methods of cult leaders. But either they have kind of use these very simple phrases, which is what Trump does, but it's very repetitive. And I think, well, he's now calling it the weave, isn't he? So he's given it a name. But the weave that he's doing just means that it's nonsense and he can't follow a train of thought to the end. But that is dissociating for the listener because the listener is trying to
Definitely.
follow a train of thought.
Definitely. But even going back to 2015, he was demonstrating his understanding, at least rudimentary, of NLP and hypnosis, as I wrote in The Cult of Trump. And there are actual authoritarian religious cults in the cult of Trump, as well as political cults, that are influencing Trump and his agenda, as well as bringing their followers. So there's it's not just that he's a malignant narcissist like Jim Jones and Hubbard and Moon and so many other cult leaders, but there's more to the psychological information warfare that's being leveled.
Well,
Um,
he's had the base of this whole thing that we're now suffering with has been building over many decades, as you point out. You know, the
exactly.
fundamentalist evangelical Christian, you know, numerous mega churches, Bill Gothard and all his lot, and many others. I mean, the uh, Unification Church, your alma mater, who yay to the Japanese. They seem to be trying to do something about
Yeah, they
that.
just dissolved, the Japanese
Fantastic.
government just dissolved them as an entity there, which I'm thrilled
Yeah.
about. And of course, all cults are frightened by because they don't want to be dissolved.
I mean, this is the tragedy, is that if we had had some better understanding about the what the chair of the charity I work with, the Family Survival Trust, refers to as criminal organizations. He doesn't like
Yeah,
to call them cults. If we had had in our various countries some legislation that
yeah.
said doing this to other people is against the law, we would not be in the mess we're in right now.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And
I totally agree. I've been doing this for 49 years full time, and I was persuaded to do my doctorate because the law needs a scientific framework to evaluate undue influence, as opposed to just it can happen to minors or elderly with dementia. No, it can happen to anyone. So I used Alan Shefflin's social influence model that he created for expert witnesses. Thank you. Um, and talked about Lifton's model, Singer's model, Shine, and trafficking law, which it is illegal to traffic people, and so yeah, so I'm trying to create that measures, but it needs to be adopted. And right now in the U.S., with the Supreme Court being hacked by Opus Dei and the Federalist Society, and Opus Dei influencing the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, it's not looking like it's going to happen anytime in the next few years, certainly, unless there's a major, positive shift.
I mean, I was honored to be asked to uh, provide a report to the January 6th Select Committee talking
hmm
about the cultic influences of the January 6th Capitol insurrection. And I just picked three of the many as examples. I looked at Trump as a cult leader. I looked at the Proud Boys as a very likely cult, and Rod of Iron Ministries, the son of Moon, which is definitely a cult. And there were many more. But just to go back to the legislation, you know, here in the UK, we've got this really great law. Again, you know, we're trying to get the same result, but we are in different areas. So there's different strategies to get that result. We have a
Right.
very good law here in the UK on coercive control, which
Yes.
exactly describes the behaviors we see in cults to a
hmm
T, all the
hmm
controlling behaviors. And it talks about if you see this pattern of behaviors, the victim may not be able to acknowledge that they're a victim. You know, it's a
hmm
great law, except for I think it's 4 words that say when this happens in an intimate or family relationship.
Exactly. It's too narrow.
So we are currently campaigning, and we're a tiny organization, but we're building a campaign to say, let's take out those 4 words. And then we have
Yep.
a really great law that we can go after these groups, because they're going to
Yep.
try and do the same here that they've done in the US. It's a little less severe because we're not a major world power, even though we like to think we still are. Um,
Yeah, but you're targeted. The UK's
oh,
targeted.
totally,
I
totally.
want to make sure that when we do the blog about this interview, we add a link to your recommendations for the January 6th committee and all the other things that people should be made aware of, like the coercive control law. We'll add that as well.
And so, you know, the January 6th thing, I was just impressed that they were able to realize that our work, and there's not a lot of us, but we're a growing number, has a lot of relevance for what's going on now.
Yeah.
And it could have been any one of us writing that report, frankly. But
Well, I can tell you, Jamie Raskin and I met, and he said he read my 3 books and my
right,
doctoral dissertation. But I think because I wrote The Cult of Trump, I was too partisan to cite. So that's my theory anyway.
he doesn't know
But
how
I'm happy
partisan
that
I
they
am.
asked
Yeah,
you.
yeah. But so there is growing awareness. That's very
Hmm.
clear. Um, I want to make a plug here for my hero, Hannah Arendt,
Okay.
and I use her work a lot in Terror, Love, and Brainwashing. And
Hmm.
she was a slightly forgotten scholar, but when Trump started getting into power back in 2016,
Yeah.
suddenly everyone got interested in her work. And
Hmm.
now, many people are reading her work. But I
Hmm.
bring her up because she was a German Jewish refugee from Hitler's regime. She escaped and moved to America, and she was just an absolutely brilliant thinker.
Hmm.
And in her book, Origins of Totalitarianism, she just lays out exactly what's happening. So
Hmm.
if anyone can read something, it's a little dense. You only have to read part 3, but it is readable. It's not
Hmm.
nonsense, and it just
Right.
describes it describes how cults operate without. She's not trying to do that. She's trying to describe the authoritarian regimes of Hitler and Stalin,
Right.
but it just is exactly the same, and it's
Mm.
exactly also what's happening in the US right now. So we owe her a great debt to understanding these things.
I confess I have not read her book. I'm familiar with the banality of evil when I guess she was quoted about Eichmann, but I also interviewed a Israeli filmmaker who found tapes of Eichmann in
Oh,
Argentina,
wow.
who was expressing really virulent anti-Semitic views, which give one the impression he wasn't just following orders; he was really a full-fledged anti-Semite who delighted in killing Jews.
I think, in my view, Banality of Evil is an important book, but the really important one is The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I think you would find it much more interesting, actually, because
I
you would
will,
you would see
on
what I'm
your say
talking about.
so.
Yeah. But
Yeah, no,
part
it's
3, go right.
yeah. So, for me at this point, time is the most scarce resource, and I always am interested in expanding my knowledge. Could you tell me what you think I might learn that I don't already know?
No, I couldn't. That's too big a question for me right
Ah,
now.
no problem. So, you talked about how the coercive control law, if you took out the family connection, it could be used more broadly. I'm familiar with Evan Stark, and I interviewed Dr. Christine Cocciola, who's an expert on coercive control. She was one of his proteges and such. But talk about what else we should know, what we can do now with this knowledge that we have.
Well, I think, I can't claim to know how to fight what's going on, but I do know that, as we started at the beginning, that speaking out,
Yes.
and those of us who feel they can, because not everybody
Yeah.
can. I mean, that terrible thing that happened this week with a young woman from this tough student being picked up off the street by
Mm-hmm.
balaclava, supposedly our government officials. Absolutely terrifying. But some of us are more safe than others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to speak out. I think we have to try to explain things to people and
Sure.
have these kind of conversations.
Sure.
Um, I think we have to protest. Um, you know, I'm very worried about the universities, some of the charities that are, I think Tim Snyder calls it obeying in advance.
Yep.
They're
Self-censorship.
I think this is terribly dangerous. And I
Yep.
think if we're involved in those kind of organizations, we may not be listened to, but I think we should at least be putting a marker down saying this is
Hmm.
not the way to fight this. We have to
Right.
actually join up with other organizations and, be unified.
Right.
Um, I think we have to try to keep other people safe who aren't safe and offer
Hmm.
some kinds of refuge to people.
Yes.
Um, sure, there's many, many other things.
Yeah, so just my life journey tells me that my influence continuum graphic is useful to folks. I don't know if you've seen it
Yes, I have.
lately,
Yeah,
but it attempts to direct people to the idea. It's not a binary, but if it respects yourself, if it respects your conscience, if it encourages critical thinking, etc., versus this dependence and obedience on the cult. And I do believe it's a dissociative disorder, so I do talk about that model. But for me, preventive education and
absolutely. Yeah.
training clinicians, media people, parents to protect their children, making an exit ramp for ex-members to feel more safe to share whatever cult they were in. Maybe they were born in it or they were recruited in it, because a lot of people keep it in the closet because they're embarrassed still or ashamed. If enough people are speaking out, it will make it safer for people to, I think, exit these extreme groups once their conscience clicks in and they realize these people don't love me. They're going to turn on me in a minute if I criticize. And that's the difference between real friendships and being in an authoritarian cult, as you know so well.
I think in terms of, shall we say, the cult of Trump, and you were mentioning this earlier, one gets so angry with people. And I have a very good friend, I mean, a really good friend, who's not
Hmm.
exactly in the cult, or let's put it this way, we disagree very fundamentally on some things to do with this. We're, and my job is not to push that person away,
Right,
which I sometimes want to do. And I keep
right.
reminding that person that though we really have these big disagreements, that we share common values.
Yes,
We both care about people. We don't want to lie and, harm other people. And it is a bit of a struggle. I mean, and
yes,
sadly, we've somewhat had to agree to not talk about politics, even though we're both very political animals.
yeah,
But I think the most important thing is that we're preserving the friendship.
I agree.
Um, so I think that's, yeah, it's a trick.
I
Yeah,
agree. And this is what I've been, calling out over and over again, that the folks that have blocked, muted their family members and friends who've gone into MAGA, it's pushing them
yeah.
deeper into MAGA instead of finding that common ground. We grew up together, where we have blood relations. Let's focus on our humanity and our shared history, and let's talk to each other. But both sides have to agree. But I've also taken that position with folks in MAGA. I'm open to talking and I'm willing to change my mind, but it needs to be more than just surfacey, sentences that you're telling me. I want to know where's the proof or where's the evidence of it. And many people say they'll read The Cult of Trump, but it's clear they don't because they don't understand the points that I'm making in it.
I have a question for you, Steve. So, someone who's gone down the rabbit hole, and I've particularly experienced this with a couple of male acquaintances
Yep.
who love to read these difficult, long, or listen to endlessly long blogs that they want to send me. to persuade me
Hmm.
of a point of view. And then when I try to discuss with them, they kind of come back with more of this. Like, well,
Hmm.
I mean, it's a little bit, sorry, I didn't mean to, right, I won't go there. They'll send me links to some other blog or some other long, very boring thing to read. Now, I'm not going to read all that stuff. It's unbearable. But I kind
Right.
of don't really know how to get them onto the reality argument and away from all this detailed, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So
Rabbit hole detail.
what I recommend is if they are open to making a pact with you, to be open minded and to really try our best to step into the other person's shoes and look at the facts and the arguments. Then I propose that a deal is made where they pick one thing,
Mm-hmm.
like a documentary that was persuasive to them or a blog, and that you agree to go through it with them on Zoom or whatever if you're in a different location. And then it's your turn to share something that was important to you so that they reciprocate and they give that level of attention that you gave them. And then it's their turn again and go back and forth versus what typically happens, at least with my experience with folks in MAGA, is they give you 50 links
Exactly.
and say, do the research.
Exactly.
And it's just, it's unbearable and it's overwhelming. And who has the time? So, but the bottom line though is this, hey, I respect you, you're intelligent, we have history, I really want to understand you. So being warm, respectful, curious, saying I'm open to being persuaded to change my mind, and I mean it. I've said this to Scientologists, including just with your mind, move that statue across the room, and I will take it seriously since you have powers to move objects, so called, from Hubbard, which they never do because they can't. But you know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
yeah.
And then
That's
you just
yeah, that's very
engage.
useful. Yeah, I like that reciprocal turn taking. That's very
And
yeah.
boundaries.
Mm,
Like you're busy, they're busy,
mm,
but let's agree to take an hour a week for
mm,
the next, 4 weeks. We'll do it as an
mm.
experiment to see how it goes. But let's genuinely try to open our minds to the other person's perspective. But the key is if it's a documentary, watching it with them
Mm,
where they can hit pause or you hit pause and say, this person that just appeared, what do you know of him?
mm,
Oh, he's a Russian agent. Hmm.
mm.
Did you know that when you
Yeah,
first watched this pandemic? Or,
right.
did you understand that, his background or how this information was twisted? Because they won't. And if they're open to what you're saying, but the point is to focus on what hit them
Mm,
that made them
mm.
convinced. That vaccines are, they're putting chips in people's bloodstreams or whatever. So, but and just say, the truth will out, and
It's
let's put our egos aside and let's pursue what's real.
it's going to be interesting with this latest scandal with the signal war plans because I think some people that is going to push them a bit too far and they're going to say, hang on a minute, I was in the army or in some part of the armed forces. I wouldn't want that out there for anyone to see. I mean, I'm being optimistic here, but
No,
still,
it's
I think it
exactly
will push a few people to question what's going on.
exactly true. Fox News was on every military base apparently around the world of the United States government. I saw an opinion piece by 3 retired generals saying we need to stop extremism in our
Yeah.
ranks, and the first step would be to make sure that is not on 24 hours a day around the world. So, I mean, that's a piece of it.
Mm.
But military people, they know that even if they were a sergeant, if they did that,
Mm-hmm.
they would be court-martialed, or they would be forced to resign. And now, with Trump saying that nothing was classified, and Tulsi Gabbard
Yeah.
and Pam Bondi saying there was nothing classified, and then it got leaked the actual texts
And
got shared.
I
It is going to cause a lot of military people
and I think
to
that's an
be.
example, Jeffrey Goldberg. He
Yes,
was
The
brave.
Atlantic.
He was brave, and he was
Hmm.
ethical.
Yep.
And we've got to hang on to these moments and these actions because they matter. And this is an example of where this has really mattered. And
Yeah, and
trying
I'll
to
just
just
add, if
yeah,
I may,
yeah.
Alexandra, Trump had Hegseth fire the top judges in the
Mm,
military who were in the position to tell the military, your order from the commander in chief is anti-constitutional, so you shouldn't follow it. He took those people out of their positions. So it's especially important. I've been telling people, talk to your family and friends in the military and ask them, if you're asked to shoot peaceful protesters, would you fire
right,
your
right.
white rifles, or would you do a drone strike on peaceful protesters? Put the seed in their minds
Mm,
that they swore an oath to the Constitution, not to Donald Trump or to Pete Hegseth,
yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So, and there's a lot of veterans who've been fired who are in civil
Hmm.
service who are now very angry
And their
and
services are going to be cut, obviously, if they haven't already. And that's going
right,
to upset a lot of people. I mean, a lot of
right,
people join the military because they want the security of those services. And fair
exactly,
enough, because they give a lot of their life up to get there. And
exactly.
it's, yeah, not to mention the old people like me who want their Social Security to come through.
Yeah, I'm on Social
I
Security and
guess you are.
Medicare. I'm
Yeah,
70 years
yeah,
old too. We're the
yeah,
same age. Yeah, I was counting on all the money that I put
yeah.
in,
But
coming
I
back.
think the problem we're facing is that things are going so rapidly.
Right.
Is it going to go more quickly than people can get to that point of questioning? And at that point, it gets, I mean, really, once they start picking people up off the street and throwing them into vans, then you're just going to start getting the naked fear where it becomes hard to
Well, that's what they're
resist.
doing. They're
Yeah,
terrorizing
yeah,
everyone by picking on an
yeah,
individual, and they're hoping everyone else will be quiet and fall in line, because that's what fascists do. And you are absolutely correct, and I'm with you that the most important thing is to not self-censor. And for those of us who have the courage to speak out, who have the expertise, to keep doing content and speaking out for those who are willing to listen. And I'm, recording as much as I can so that if they do pick me up on the street, at least all my recordings will still hopefully be protected and be available for people to watch.
yeah.
Yep. So, any future directions, if there are any young people going into social psychology or wanting to study what they can do? Any
Um,
recommendations?
well, one thing is I am seeing, and I'm sure you are too, what we're getting, this is more in the kind of activist space, but also in
Yes.
going into academia, is people who are born or raised in cults. So the way I
Yep.
kind of see it is the cult scholarship, if you want, with the Liftons and Margaret Singer, started with people who were kind of not in cults, but who studied totalitarianism. And
Right.
then kind of broadly speaking, came our generation with Yanya Lalich and others who had been in cults. So we had quite a different view, but we
Yep.
built on the work of the previous generation.
Exactly.
And now I think we're getting people who are born and brought up in cults, building on what's come before them. And they're a feisty bunch, I tell you. They're not going to
Yes.
easily be shamed. I mean, they are shamed. I don't want to take that away because they do suffer shame. But it's much harder to say that they were stupid or it was their fault because they just got
Right.
born into the damn thing.
Right.
And they're angry, a lot of them. And
Rightfully
so I
so.
think they're, in a way, I've got a lot of faith and hope in that generation that they're not going to be very easily silenced. I mean, the other side of it is they, of course, carry a lot of terrible trauma. I would argue more than
Yes.
us first generation people. So they
Yeah.
have more barriers. But boy, they're angry and they're bright and they're going into academia, they're going into activism. And I think that's starting to make itself felt. Um,
Yes. And I
yeah,
just came from a neuroscience conference, and because I was talking about, my work and the cult of Trump, etc., 10 different people came up to me and told me what group
yeah,
they were born
yeah,
or raised in,
yeah.
but they're like top
Fantastic,
neuroscientists, but
fantastic.
they haven't told
Yeah,
anyone what group
yeah,
they were in, but they are brilliant.
yeah. And that's the other thing, young people who maybe did enter cults as adults or as teenagers. I'm thinking of a couple of people in specific that I'm working with. Um, they've got a lot more resources to work with. I mean, when I came out, I had your book, I had, I think, an article, the Margaret Singer book, I had Lifton. There was not that much. And
Right.
there is a lot more now. So those young people have more resources. And
Not to mention online
yeah,
resources, because when I got out in
there
76, we
was
had
no
the
online.
Dewey Decimal
Yeah.
System, and it was a paucity of literature.
So I think, there has been a growing movement really across the world. Um, and in terms of encouraging people, I think trying to be in some kind of organization is helpful, even though that's very difficult for people who've been in cults. And I can
Yes.
tell you it's very difficult to run such an organization. It's like
Right.
herding cats. Um,
Yes.
but you are stronger if you can find a way to work with other people. But just be alert. If people start behaving badly, you don't have to put up with it. Um,
Right.
um,
Yeah,
I
don't silence your
yeah,
voice, especially your inner
yeah,
voice that says, I don't like that
yeah.
thing.
And
That's not right.
if you're of an academic bent, for me, my years doing my PhD, I feel were actually a great privilege. And I was someone who always rebelled at school. I hated school. But actually doing the PhD was a marvelous thing for me. But you do have to be the kind of person who wants to sit and read books for a couple of years and not do anything else.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we've got a lot of room for activists, a lot of room for all these independent podcasters and,
Yep.
filmmakers. We need more people who've had lived experience to be involved in making documentaries so that we have less salacious, um,
Yep.
voyeuristic content and more useful with some analysis content.
Yeah, when you said voyeuristic,
Uh,
I call it trauma porn.
yeah, it is. I hate it.
That they focus on the most sensationalist
Yeah,
cults, and they don't explain
yeah,
social psychology
yeah.
or how people are deceived or indoctrinated with phobias. So people watch it, but it doesn't improve their ability to protect themselves
And it
or understand.
also actually, in a way, does the opposite because they can still say, oh, that's those weird people over there.
Right.
Instead of being
Good
able to
point.
connect it and say, oh, yeah, my neighbor was in a funny little church or my brother was, which does also happen. The better documentaries do bring out in people's
Yes.
minds, they're able to make the connections, but not, yeah. So
Yeah,
there's a lot
great.
of avenues for people to make their contribution about this. And as we've seen, it's not just about cults, it's about our political system. And it's really, really important. What we have to say, really important, because we understand how people can get hooked into these things.
Right. And my view is that China is a political
Mm.
cult, Russia is a political
Mm.
cult, and the United States is a cult
It's
with
becoming
lots of
one.
religious cults in it and other bad actors that want to destroy America's power and good standing in the world, undo the U.S. dollar, etc. Thank you, Alexandra Stein, PhD, social psychologist. I'm just going to hold up I believe there's a second edition, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, Attachment in Cults and Totalitarian Systems. And let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Good to talk to you again. Keep up the good
Likewise.
work.
Thank you. Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.